She stood by the grave, clutching her shawl as the rain poured down, alone, broken, and lost in memories. A stranger stepped forward, quiet and gentle, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Don't cry," he said softly, his voice trembling with something more than pity. She looked up, confused, until he pulled a worn letter from his coat. It was signed by her late husband, and the man before her whispered, "I was his partner, and I've come to finish what he started." The rain came down like judgment. It struck the farmhouse roof in uneven beats, pooling in the ruts of the dirt road and turning the world into a gray smear of wind and water. Clara Mayfield stood at the kitchen window, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching the evening dissolve into storm. The lamp on the table behind her flickered once, twice, then steadied, a small, fragile light in a house that had grown used to darkness. She hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days. There was no one to speak to. The chickens didn't need her voice, only her hands. The cow in the barn chewed its cud in silence. The fields beyond the fence lay fallow, waiting for a man who would never return to turn the soil. Her husband had been gone 8 months now, swept away in a cattle drive that ended in blood and mud somewhere north of the Rio Grande. They'd sent his hat back in a canvas sack. Nothing else. No body, no answers. Just the hat, stained dark along the brim, and a handwritten note from the foreman that said, "He died brave." She didn't know what brave meant anymore. The thunder rolled in from the west, low and heavy, shaking the walls. Clara stepped back from the window and wiped her palms on her apron. The stove needed feeding. The bread dough sat covered on the counter, barely risen. She'd needed it that morning without thinking, the way her hands had learned to work without her heart's permission. Flour, water, salt, fold, press, repeat. It was the rhythm of survival, and survival was all she had left. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the rain. Hooves, slow, uneven. Her breath caught. She turned toward the door, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. No one came out this far, not unless they were lost or desperate. The knock came a moment later. 3 solid raps against the wood, firm but not angry. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the drawer beside the stove, where the revolver lay wrapped in a dish towel. Her fingers closed around the grip, cold and heavier than she remembered. She pulled it free, checked the chamber with shaking hands, and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd hoped. Silence. Then a man's voice, rough and low, barely louder than the rain. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to trouble you. I need shelter. Just for the night." She didn't answer. Her thumb rested on the hammer of the revolver, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Strangers didn't come to the door asking politely. They came with demands. Or worse. "Ma'am, please." His voice cracked slightly, and she heard the exhaustion in it, the kind that came from riding too long in the cold. "I won't harm you. I can't ride any further tonight." Clara closed her eyes, pressed her forehead against the door frame, and felt the weight of every choice she'd ever made pressing down on her shoulders. She could send him away. She could fire a warning shot into the dirt and watch him disappear back into the storm. Or she could open the door. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch looked like he'd been dragged through hell and left to walk home. His coat was torn at the shoulder, soaked through to the skin. His hat hung low over his face, rain pouring off the brim in a steady stream. His horse stood a few paces back, head down, sides heaving. He didn't move toward her, didn't step forward, just stood there, water dripping from his boots, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara's grip tightened on the revolver, still hidden behind the doorframe. She studied him in the dim light spilling from the house, tall, broad-shouldered, but bent with fatigue. His face was shadowed, but she could see the stubble on his jaw, the lines around his mouth. Older than her, maybe, or just worn down faster. "Barn's out back," she said. "You can sleep there. I'll bring you something to eat." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That's kind of you, ma'am." He turned to go, but as he did, something caught the light. A glint of gold at his waist, a watch chain, half hidden beneath his coat. Clara's breath stalled. She knew that chain, or one just like it. Her husband had worn the same kind, a gift from his father, a railroad watch with an engraved case. She'd held it in her hands the night before he left, winding it for him while he kissed her hair and promised he'd be back before winter. The stranger didn't notice her staring. He tugged his hat lower and led his horse toward the barn, disappearing into the rain-soaked dark. Clara stood in the doorway, the revolver still in her hand, her mind spinning. It could be coincidence. Plenty of men carried pocket watches. But something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the quiet in his voice, stirred a memory she couldn't quite place. She closed the door and locked it. Then she set the revolver on the table and covered her face with her hands. An hour later, she carried a plate of bread and cold ham out to the barn, wrapped in a cloth to keep the rain off. The storm had softened into a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked into everything without making a sound. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, one she'd been meaning to fix for months. She nudged it open with her shoulder and stepped inside. The stranger had made a place for himself in the corner, on a pile of old hay near the horse stalls. His coat hung over a beam to dry, his hat beside it. He'd built a small fire in a tin bucket, just enough to take the chill off, and sat with his back against the wall, his eyes closed. He looked younger without the hat. Maybe 30, maybe less. His face was lined with travel and something heavier, grief maybe, or guilt. He opened his eyes when she approached. "Brought you this," Clara said, holding out the plate. He took it carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. "Thank you." She didn't leave. She stood there, arms crossed, watching him. He ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd learned not to take food for granted. When he finished, he set the plate aside and looked up at her. "You want to ask me something?" It wasn't a question. Clara's jaw tightened. "That watch, where'd you get it?" His hand moved instinctively to his belt, where the chain still hung. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her with dark, tired eyes that seemed to carry more weight than a man his age should bear. "It was given to me," he said finally, "by a friend." "What friend?" He hesitated. "Then quietly, a man I rode with. A long time ago." Clara's chest tightened. "What was his name?" The stranger didn't answer. He just looked at her, and in that silence she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or sorrow. "Get some rest," she said, her voice brittle. "You'll leave in the morning." She turned and walked out before he could say another word. Back inside the house, Clara sat at the kitchen table and stared at the lamp flame until her eyes burned. The rain had stopped. The world outside was still and black, the kind of quiet that felt like holding your breath. She didn't know what to think, didn't know what to feel. The watch could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. She pulled open the drawer beside the stove and took out the only photograph she had of her husband. It was small, faded, taken at a county fair 3 summers ago. He stood beside another man, both of them smiling, arms slung over each other's shoulders. She'd never asked who the other man was. Some ranch hand, she'd assumed. A friend from the drive. She held the photograph up to the light, and her blood went cold. The man in the picture, the one standing beside her husband, had the same build, the same dark eyes, the same line of his jaw. It was him. The stranger in the barn. Clara set the photograph down with trembling hands and pressed her palms flat against the table. Her mind raced, spinning through possibilities, each one sharper than the last. Who was he? Why had he come here? What did he know about her husband's death? And why hadn't he told her the truth? Outside, the wind picked up again, stirring the trees beyond the fence. The barn door creaked softly in the distance. Clara sat alone in the lamplight, her heart pounding, her thoughts tangled in fear and something else. Something she didn't want to name. Curiosity, or maybe hope. She didn't sleep that night, and when morning light broke through the mist, pale and hesitant, she looked out the window and saw him standing in the yard, silent, still, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the fields as if they belonged to him once. The morning came cold and clear, the kind of dawn that made the world look new even when it wasn't. Clara stood at the stove, frying eggs in the cast-iron skillet her mother had given her on her wedding day. The yolk split and spread across the pan, golden and bright, and she watched it without really seeing. Her hands moved on their own, flipping the eggs, pouring coffee, setting the table for one. She'd done it so many times now that it felt like breathing, automatic, empty, necessary. But today, something was different. Through the window above the sink she could see him, the stranger. He stood near the barn, one hand resting on the fence post, his gaze fixed on the eastern fields where the sun climbed slow and quiet over the ridge. He hadn't moved in 10 minutes, just stood there, still as stone, like a man trying to remember something he'd lost. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and poured a second cup of coffee. She didn't know why, didn't question it, just carried it out to him, the steam curling up into the cool air. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his expression unreadable. "Thought you might want this," she said, holding out the cup. He took it with both hands, as if the warmth mattered more than the drink. "Thank you." They stood there in silence, side by side, looking out at the fields. The grass was tall and wild, untended since last spring. Her husband had always kept it short, said it made the land look honest. Now it just looked abandoned. "You planning to leave today?" she asked, not looking at him. "If that's what you want." Clara's jaw tightened. "I didn't say that." He glanced at her, just a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "Then I'll stay. If you'll have me, why?" The word came out sharper than she'd meant. He didn't flinch. "Because I owe it to him." Her heart stopped. She turned to face him fully, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You knew my husband. It wasn't a question." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I did." "Then why didn't you say so last night? Because the first didn't know if you'd let me stay if I told you the truth." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "What truth?" He looked away, out toward the fields again, his voice quiet and careful. "That I was with him the night he died." The world tilted. Clara took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "You were there?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why didn't you come here sooner? Why didn't you tell me what happened?" He didn't answer right away, just stood there, holding the coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, raw. "Because I didn't know how to face you." His name was Elias Gray. He told her that much over breakfast, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, his hat resting on the chair beside him. He ate slowly, methodically, the way he'd done the night before, and Clara watched him with a strange mix of anger and something softer, something she didn't want to name. He told her he'd ridden with her husband for 3 years, that they'd worked the same cattle drives, slept under the same stars, shared the same campfires, that her husband had been the best man he'd ever known, steady, kind, the kind of man who'd give you his last dollar if you needed it. He told her about the storm, the one that had come down fast and brutal, scattering the herd across the canyon, how the lightning had spooked the cattle, how the river had swelled and turned the crossing into a death trap, how her husband had gone in first, trying to lead the herd across, and how the current had taken him before anyone could reach him. "I tried," Elias said, his voice breaking. "I went in after him, but the water was too fast, too strong. I couldn't." He stopped, his hands flat on the table, his knuckles white. Clara stared at him, her chest tight, her eyes burning. "They told me he died brave." "He did. They didn't tell me you were there." Elias looked up at her, his face carved with grief. "I didn't give them my name. I left the drive that night. Couldn't stay after that." "Where did you go?" "Nowhere. Everywhere." He shook his head. "Didn't matter. I couldn't outrun it." Clara's throat ached. She wanted to scream at him, to blame him, to make him carry the weight of her grief. But looking at him now, at the hollowness in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the burden of memory, she realized he already did. "Why did you come here?" she asked quietly. He met her gaze. "Because I made him a promise before he went under. He grabbed my arm and said, 'Take care of Clara,' and I said I would." Her breath caught. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the sob rising in her throat. "I didn't know where you were," Elias continued. "Took me 6 months to find you, and when I did, I didn't know what to say, didn't know if you'd want to hear it." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "So you just stood in the rain and asked for shelter?" "Yes, ma'am." She let out a shaky breath. "You're a damn fool, Elias Gray." He nodded. "I know." The days that followed were strange and delicate, like walking on frost-thin ice. Elias stayed. Clara didn't ask him to, but she didn't ask him to leave either. He slept in the barn, ate his meals in silence, and worked the land as if it had always been his to tend. He fixed the barn door she'd been meaning to repair, replaced the broken fence posts along the western pasture, cleared the brush from the irrigation ditch, and oiled the windmill until it turned smooth and quiet again. Clara watched him from the porch, her arms crossed, her heart tangled in something she couldn't name. He moved like her husband had moved, steady, deliberate, never wasting emotion. The way he tied a knot, the way he wiped his hands on his jeans before picking up a tool, the way he hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening. It unnerved her, and it comforted her. She didn't know which was worse. The town noticed. Of course they did. Small towns always did. When Clara rode into Stillwater to buy flour and kerosene, the stairs followed her down Main Street like shadows. Mrs. Henderson at the general store leaned over the counter, her voice low and syrupy. "Who's that man staying at your place, dear?" Clara's jaw tightened. "A friend." "A friend?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows arched. "Folks are saying he looks like trouble." Folks should mind their business. Clara paid for her goods and left before the woman could say another word. But as she loaded the supplies into the wagon, she felt eyes on her. The blacksmith, the bank clerk, the men loitering outside the saloon. They didn't say anything, didn't have to. Their silence was louder than any accusation. Sheriff Dalton stepped out of his office as she climbed into the wagon seat. He was a tall man, broad and graying, with a face that had seen too much and believed too little. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Mayfield, Sheriff, heard you've got a guest." Clara's hands tightened on the reins. "I do. Mind if I ask who he is?" "A friend of my husband's." Dalton's gaze sharpened. "That's so." "It is." He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "Well, you be careful, ma'am. Lot of men passing through these days. Not all of them honest. I'll keep that in mind." She snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the sheriff standing in the dust. Her heart pounded all the way home. That night, Clara found Elias sitting on the porch steps, his coat pulled tight against the cold. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like broken glass. He didn't look up when she sat down beside him. "Town's talking," she said. "I figured. Sheriff asked about you." Elias's jaw tightened. "What'd you tell him?" "That you were a friend of my husband's." He nodded. "That's the truth, is it?" He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes were dark and unreadable. "What do you want me to say, Clara?" It was the first time he'd said her name. It sounded strange on his lips, familiar and foreign all at once. "I want you to tell me the truth," she said. "All of it." Elias looked away, his hands folded between his knees. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, quietly, "Your husband and I, we weren't just friends, we were partners in everything. The drives, the money, the risks." He paused. "When he died there was money owed, to both of us. But the foreman took it all. Said I didn't have a right to it since I left." Clara's chest tightened. "How much? Enough to save this place?" She stared at him, her mind spinning. "And you came here to give you what's yours," he said. "But I don't have it yet. I'm still trying to get it back." "From who?" "The men who took it." Clara's breath caught. "That's why the sheriff's watching you." Elias nodded. "Probably." She looked out at the fields, at the dark line of the horizon, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. "You should have told me. I know. You should have told me the first night. I know." She stood, brushing the dust off her skirt, and looked down at him. "If you're going to stay, I need to trust you. And I can't do that if you keep hiding things from me." Elias rose to his feet, his gaze steady. "I won't hide anything else, I swear it." Clara held his eyes for a long moment, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. "Then stay," she said quietly, and she walked back inside, leaving him alone under the stars. Inside the house, Clara lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table. Her hands shook as she opened the small wooden box where she kept her husband's things, his hat, his letters, the photograph. She pulled the photograph out and stared at it, at the two men smiling side by side, and felt something crack open inside her. He'd been here all along, in the picture, in the story, in the life her husband had lived before he came home to her. And now he was here, standing in the yard, working the land, carrying the weight of a promise she never asked him to make. Clara pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't cry. Spring came slowly, like a secret the land wasn't ready to share. The frost loosened its grip on the fields, and the grass turned from brittle brown to soft green. The creek behind the house swelled with snowmelt, rushing over stones that had been silent all winter. Wildflowers appeared in clusters along the fence line, small, stubborn blooms of yellow and white that Clara hadn't noticed before. Or maybe she had once, and had forgotten how to see them. Elias was the one who pointed them out. "Look at that," he said one morning, crouched beside the fence with a hammer in one hand. He nodded toward a patch of flowers growing wild near the post. "Hadn't seen those in years." Clara paused, a bucket of water in her hands, and followed his gaze. My husband planted those. Before the drive. Elias looked up at her, something soft passing over his face. He had a good eye. He did. They stood there for a moment, the morning light spilling over the fields, and Clara felt something shift inside her, something small and fragile, like ice beginning to crack. The work became a rhythm. Elias rose before dawn, saddled his horse, and rode out to check the fences. Clara fed the chickens, milked the cow, and started the fire in the stove. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, they'd meet in the yard, dirt on their hands, coffee in their cups, and exchange the kind of quiet nods that didn't need words. He taught her how to fix the windmill when the blades jammed, showed her how to splice rope so it wouldn't fray, helped her turn the soil in the garden her husband had started, rows of earth waiting for seeds that never came. You ever plant before? He asked, kneeling beside her in the dirt. Not really. My husband did most of it. Then we'll do it together. And they did, side by side, pressing seeds into the ground, covering them with soil, watering them with the creek water that ran cold and clear. Clara's hands ached by the end of it, blistered and sore, but she didn't mind. It felt good to make something grow again. One afternoon, Elias rode into town for supplies. Clara stayed behind, washing clothes in the big tin basin out back, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The sun was warm on her shoulders, the first real warmth she'd felt in months, and she found herself humming. A tune she didn't recognize at first, something soft and low. Then she realized it was the same tune Elias had been humming the day before. She stopped, her hands stilling in the soapy water, and felt her chest tighten. She didn't know when it had started, the way his presence had become familiar, the way his voice no longer startled her, the way she found herself, listening for his footsteps in the morning, the sound of his horse in the yard, the quiet hum of his breath when he worked. It scared her, not because she didn't trust him, but because she did. When Elias returned, he brought more than supplies. He brought a letter. Clara was sitting on the porch mending a shirt when he dismounted and walked up the steps. He held the envelope out to her, his expression unreadable. This came for you. She took it, frowning. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and formal. She turned it over, broke the seal, and unfolded the paper inside. It was from the foreman of the cattle drive, the one who'd sent her husband's hat. Mrs. Mayfield, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to inform you that the matter of wages owed to your late husband has been settled. A sum of $200 has been deposited with the bank in Stillwater under your name. I apologize for the delay. Respectfully, J.T. Hollis. Clara read it twice, her hands trembling. $200. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fix the roof, buy seed, maybe even hire help come harvest. She looked up at Elias, who was watching her carefully. You knew about this, she said. I did. You went to him. Elias nodded. Wrote out last week. Told him it wasn't right, keeping money that belonged to you. Clara's throat tightened. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She stood, folding the letter carefully, and met his eyes. Thank you. He tipped his hat. It's what he would have wanted. That evening, Clara made a proper dinner. Roasted chicken, potatoes, greens from the garden. She set the table for two, something she hadn't done in months. And when Elias came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway, his hat in his hands. You didn't have to. Sit down, she said. He did. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the scrape of forks against tin plates. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt like trust, earned, not given. Halfway through the meal, Clara looked up at him. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you go back? After the drive, you could have found work somewhere else. Started over. Elias set his fork down, his jaw tightening. I tried. But everywhere I went, I kept seeing him. In the way the sun hit the fields. In the sound of the river. In every man who worked too hard and talked too little. He paused. Couldn't outrun it. So I stopped trying. Clara's chest ached. And you came here. And I came here. She looked down at her plate, her hands folded in her lap. I'm glad you did. He glanced up, surprise flickering across his face. You are? Yes. They didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and true. That night, after the dishes were washed and the lamp turned low, Clara sat at the piano in the corner of the room. It was an old upright, scarred and out of tune. A gift from her mother when she'd married. She hadn't played it in months, hadn't been able to bear the sound. But tonight she lifted the fallboard and let her fingers rest on the keys. She didn't play. Just sat there, feeling the weight of the ivory beneath her hands, remembering the way her husband used to sit beside her, his hand on her shoulder, humming along while she played. "He wrote a song for you." Clara's breath caught. She turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression soft. "What? Your husband? He wrote a song, played it for me once, around the campfire, said it was for you." Clara's eyes burned. "I didn't know he could write music." "He couldn't, not really, but he tried." Elias stepped closer, his voice quiet. "Said it reminded him of home. Do you remember it?" He hesitated. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and sat down beside her on the bench. His hands hovered over the keys, uncertain, and then he played. It was simple, just a handful of notes repeated softly, like a lullaby. But it was enough. Clara closed her eyes and felt the tears slip down her cheeks. When the last note faded, Elias pulled his hands back and stood. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No," Clara whispered. "Thank you." He nodded once, then walked out, leaving her alone in the lamplight. And for the first time since her husband died, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt peace. The weeks passed like water over stone, slow, steady, shaping everything without anyone noticing. Elias stayed, not because she asked him to, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because somehow this place had become his to tend, and she had become someone he couldn't leave behind. They worked the land together, planted the garden, mended the fences, fixed the roof where it leaked. And in the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the hills, the sky turning gold and red and purple, and didn't need to say a word. One afternoon, Clara laughed. She didn't mean to. It just came out, sudden and bright, like something breaking free. Elias had been trying to fix the barn door, and it had fallen off the hinges entirely, landing in the dirt with a thud. He'd stood there staring at it, and then looked up at her with such bewilderment that she couldn't help it. She laughed, and he did too. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. The sound was rough and unused, like something that had been locked away for too long, but it was real. And it was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in months. But peace, like all fragile things, doesn't last. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the yard, Elias saddled his horse and rode into town. He didn't say why, didn't need to. Clara watched him go, her arms crossed, a knot forming in her stomach. He came back hours later, his face dark, his shoulders tense. He dismounted, tied the horse, and walked straight past her into the barn without a word. Clara followed. "What happened?" He didn't answer, just stood there, his hands braced against the wall, his head bowed. "Elias, they know." Her blood went cold. Who knows what? The men from the drive, the ones who took the money. He turned to face her, his eyes hard. "They're in Stillwater, and they know I'm here." Clara's heart pounded. "What are they going to do?" "I don't know, but they won't let it go. Not after what I did." She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. "Then we'll face them. Together." Elias shook his head. "No. This is my fight. It stopped being just your fight the moment you walked onto this land." He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something break in him, something he'd been holding onto too tightly for too long. "I don't want you hurt," he said quietly, "and I don't want you dead." They stood there in the dim light of the barn, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down between them. Then Elias pulled something from his coat, a folded piece of paper, worn and creased. He held it out to her. "What is this?" "A letter, from your husband. He gave it to me the night before he died. Told me to give it to you if anything happened to him." Clara's hands shook as she took it. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" "Because I wasn't ready." She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, and felt her world tilt. "Clara, if you're reading this, then I'm not coming home, and I need you to know that's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault, it's just the way things go sometimes. Elias is a good man, the best I've ever known. If he finds you, let him stay. He'll take care of you the way I should have. I love you, always. James." Clara's vision blurred. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered. "I should have told you sooner." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. He loved you, I know, and you loved him. Elias's jaw tightened. Yes. Clara stepped forward and took his hand. Then we finish this. Together. He nodded. And that night, as the fire crackled low in the stove and the stars turned overhead, Elias burned the letter, not to hide it but to let it go. The ashes scattered over the photograph of two men smiling side by side, and in the morning everything would change. But peace, like all fragile things, breaks easily, and the next knock on the door came not from mercy, but from the law. The dust came first. Clara saw it from the kitchen window, a thin brown cloud rising over the eastern road, moving slow and deliberate like a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. She set down the cup she'd been washing, her hands dripping soap onto the floor, and watched the cloud grow larger, closer. Behind her, Elias stood in the doorway, his coffee forgotten on the table. He'd seen it too. You should go inside, he said quietly. No. Clara, no. She dried her hands on her apron and walked out onto the porch, her spine straight, her chin lifted. If trouble was coming, she'd meet it standing. Elias followed, his jaw set, his hand resting on the post beside her. They waited. The wagon rattled into view a few minutes later, a buckboard pulled by two tired horses, their heads low, their sides streaked with sweat. Sheriff Dalton sat at the reins, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, his face carved from stone. Beside him sat a younger man Clara didn't recognize, lean, hard-eyed, with a rifle propped between his knees. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the porch, and the horses stamped and snorted, their breath steaming in the cool air. Dalton climbed down slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on Elias. Elias Gray, it wasn't a question. Elias nodded once. Sheriff. Dalton reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a telegram yellowed and creased. He held it up like evidence at a trial. Got this 3 days ago. From a cattle outfit up in Colorado. Says you're wanted for theft. Says you ran off with money that didn't belong to you. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. That's not true. Dalton's eyes flicked to her, cold and measuring. Ma'am, I'm not here to argue facts. I'm here to do my job. Your job is to protect people, not arrest innocent men. Innocent? The younger man spoke up now, his voice sharp and mocking. He stepped down from the wagon, the rifle still in his hands. Lady, this man stole from honest workers, left good men with nothing while he rode off with their pay. Elias's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed level. I didn't steal anything. That money was owed to me. And to James Mayfield. The mention of her husband's name hung in the air like smoke. Dalton's eyes narrowed. You saying you worked that drive? I did. Then why'd you leave, before the foreman paid out? Because he wasn't going to pay me. Elias's voice hardened. He took what was owed to me and James and kept it for himself. Called it administrative fees. I left because staying would have meant watching him steal from a dead man's wife. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. He's telling the truth. The foreman sent me a letter a few weeks ago. Paid me $200 he said was owed to my husband. Elias is the one who made him do it. Dalton didn't answer right away. He looked from Clara to Elias, his face unreadable. Then he folded the telegram and tucked it back into his coat. That may be, he said slowly. But the law doesn't care about what's right. It cares about what's legal, and right now, there's a warrant with your name on it. Then the law's wrong, Clara said. The sheriff's gaze softened, just for a moment, maybe, but I still have to bring him in. Elias stepped forward, his hands raised slightly, palms out. I'll go. Just give me a minute to get my things. No, Clara said, her voice breaking. You're not going anywhere. Clara, I said no. She moved in front of him, placing herself between Elias and the sheriff. Her arms crossed, her eyes blazing. Dalton sighed and rubbed his face with one hand. Mrs. Mayfield, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. Then don't. Step aside. No. The younger man shifted, raising the rifle slightly. Sheriff, you want me to— Put that down, Miller, Dalton snapped. He looked back at Clara, his voice quieter now. Ma'am, I understand you've been through a lot. Losing your husband, trying to keep this place running. But harboring a wanted man won't help you. It'll only make things worse. He's not a wanted man. He's a man who kept a promise. Dalton's jaw tightened. That's not for you to decide. Then who decides? Clara's voice rose, sharp and desperate. Men who weren't there. Men who didn't see what happened. Men who'd rather believe a lie because it's easier than admitting the truth. The sheriff didn't answer. He just stood there, the weight of his badge pressing down on him like chains. Elias placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. It's all right. It's not. Yes, it is. He looked at her, and his eyes were calm, resigned. I knew this was coming, knew it the moment I decided to stay. Then why did you? Because some promises are worth keeping, even if they cost you everything. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. Don't do this. I have to. He stepped past her, moving toward the wagon, and Clara felt something inside her shatter. She reached for his arm, her fingers closing around his sleeve. Wait. Elias stopped. She let go and walked back into the house, moving quickly, her mind spinning. She crossed to the small wooden box on the shelf above the stove, the one where she kept her husband's things. Her hands shook as she opened it, sifting through the letters and the hat and the photograph until she found what she was looking for. A piece of paper, folded and worn, tucked beneath everything else. She'd found it weeks ago, hidden in one of her husband's old coats. She hadn't understood what it was at first. Just a receipt, signed by the foreman, acknowledging payment to James Mayfield and Elias Gray for services rendered on the Colorado cattle drive. The amount was listed clearly, $400, split evenly, but only half had been paid. Clara carried the receipt out to the porch and held it up, her hand steady now. Sheriff, you need to see this. Dalton took the paper, his eyes scanning the faded ink. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Where'd you get this? My husband kept it. He knew the foreman was lying, he just didn't live long enough to prove it. The sheriff looked at Elias. You knew about this? I did. Why didn't you show it to anyone? Because no one would have believed me. A drifter's word against a foreman's? I'd have been hung before I made it to trial. Dalton was quiet for a long moment. Then he folded the receipt carefully and handed it back to Clara. This doesn't change the warrant. Clara's heart sank. But it does change my report, Dalton continued. He looked at his deputy. Miller, get back in the wagon. The younger man frowned. Sheriff, the warrant says. I know what the warrant says. Now get in the wagon. Miller hesitated, then climbed back onto the seat, muttering under his breath. Dalton turned to Elias, his voice low. You've got 48 hours. Elias blinked. What? 48 hours to get out of this county. After that, I can't protect you. Understood? Why are you doing this? Dalton glanced at Clara, then back at Elias. Because I knew James Mayfield, and I know he wouldn't have trusted you if you weren't worth trusting. He tipped his hat. Don't make me regret this. He climbed back onto the wagon, snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward. The buckboard rolled away, the dust rising again, and Clara stood on the porch, her legs shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Elias turned to her, his face pale. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He could have arrested you too. For obstruction. I don't care. She walked past him, back into the house, and sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to fold them in her lap to keep them still. Elias followed, standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. Clara, don't. I need to say this. Then say it. He took a breath. I'm not running. Her head snapped up. What? I'm not running, he repeated. I spent the last 8 months running from the truth, from the guilt, from everything, and I'm done. If you stay, they'll arrest you. Maybe, but at least I'll have fought for something that mattered. Clara stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't fight a warrant, Elias. You can't fight the law. No, but I can fight the men who made it necessary. Her stomach dropped. What are you talking about? The foreman. The men who stole that money. They're the ones who sent the warrant. They're the ones who want me gone. His eyes hardened. If I can prove they lied, the warrant disappears. And how do you plan to do that? By finding them. And making them tell the truth. Clara shook her head, her voice rising. That's suicide. It's justice. It's the same thing. Elias crossed the room, his hands gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white. Your husband died because of those men, because they were careless. and greedy and didn't care who got hurt as long as they got paid. I stood by and let it happen because I didn't know how to stop it. He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw. I won't make that mistake again. Clara stared at him, her chest aching, her mind spinning. She wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him see reason, but she couldn't, because deep down, she understood. This wasn't about the money, it wasn't even about the warrant, it was about honor and grief, and the weight of a promise that wouldn't let him go. Then I'm coming with you, she said. No. Yes, Clara, this isn't your fight. It is now. They stood there, locked in a battle of wills, neither one willing to back down. Finally, Elias let out a long breath and nodded. All right. But we do this my way. Agreed. And if things go bad, they won't. If they do, he insisted, you get out. You run. You don't look back. Clara met his gaze, her voice steady. I'm not leaving you. He didn't argue, just nodded once, his jaw tight. Then we leave at first light. That night, Clara packed a small bag, a blanket, some dried meat, a canteen of water. She moved through the house like a ghost, her hands working on their own, her mind somewhere far away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and the sky turned dark and restless. Elias sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, the barrel gleaming in the lamplight. He worked in silence, methodical and focused, and Clara watched him through the window, her heart heavy. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if they'd find the men they were looking for, didn't know if they'd make back alive. But she knew one thing, she wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. When the first light of dawn broke over the ridge, pale and cold, they saddled the horses and rode west, toward the valley where men went to disappear. The farmhouse grew smaller behind them, fading into the mist, and Clara didn't look back. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. As they rode toward the valley, dawn crept behind them, pale and uncertain, like forgiveness itself. The valley opened before them like a wound in the earth. It was a place where the land turned brutal. Jagged ridges of gray stone rising on either side, slopes thick with scrub pine and thorn brush, and a narrow creek winding through the bottom, dark and cold as iron. The sky hung low overhead, pressing down with clouds the color of old bruises, and the wind came in sharp gusts that smelled of rain and something older, something that warned travelers to turn back. Clara and Elias rode in silence, their horses picking their way carefully over loose shale and tangled roots. The sound of hooves on stone echoed off the canyon walls, hollow and strange, like the valley itself was listening. Clara's hands ached from gripping the reins, her shoulders tight with tension, but she didn't complain, didn't speak, just kept her eyes on the trail ahead and tried not to think about how far they'd come from home. Elias rode ahead of her, his back straight, his rifle across his saddle. He hadn't said more than a dozen words since they'd left at dawn, and Clara didn't push him. She could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze swept the ridges above them, always watching, always wary. They were hunting men who didn't want to be found, and men like that had a way of making sure they stayed hidden. By midday, the rain started. It came down in cold, hard sheets, turning the trail into slick mud and filling the air with a gray haze that made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her hat brim already soaked through, water dripping down the back of her neck. Her horse stumbled once, catching itself, and she leaned forward, murmuring softly to calm it. Elias reined in his horse and turned back to her. We need to find shelter. Where? Clara shouted over the rain. He pointed up the slope to their left, where a dark shape jutted out from the rock face. There. Looks like an overhang. They guided the horses up the incline, the animals slipping and scrambling for footing, and when they finally reached the outcrop, Clara slid from the saddle with a gasp of relief. The overhang wasn't much, just a shallow cave carved into the stone by wind and water. But it was dry, and that was enough. Elias tied the horses to a gnarled juniper tree and helped Clara unload the saddlebags. They spread the blanket on the ground and sat side by side, their backs against the cold stone, watching the rain pour down like a curtain across the valley below. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "How much farther?" Elias didn't look at her. "Another day, maybe two. Do you know where they are?" I know where they were. Last I heard, they were holed up in a mining camp near the north fork of the creek, place called Blackthorn Ridge. Clara frowned. I've heard of it. They say it's where men go when they're done with the law. That's right. And you think they're still there? If they're smart, they are. It's the kind of place where nobody asks questions and everybody minds their own business. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. What if they don't tell the truth? What if we ride all this way and they just deny everything? Elias's jaw tightened. Then I'll make them tell it. There was something cold in his voice, something sharp and unforgiving, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the quiet exterior, the man who'd survived cattle drives and river crossings and the death of his closest friend, the man who'd carried grief like a second skin and hadn't let it break him. You've done this before, she said softly, haven't you? Elias didn't answer right away. He stared out at the rain, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, once, a long time ago, what happened? I survived. The other man didn't. Clara's chest tightened. Elias, I'm not proud of it, he said, cutting her off. But I'm not ashamed either. He had it coming. And if these men have it coming too, then so be it. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that vengeance wasn't the same as justice. But looking at him now, at the hard line of his mouth, the shadows in his eyes, she realized he already knew that, and he'd made his peace with it. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe that was why he was here. The rain stopped an hour later, leaving the world damp and silent and smelling of wet stone. They mounted the horses and rode on, deeper into the valley, following the creek as it twisted and turned through the narrow canyon. The walls rose higher on either side, blocking out the sky, and the air grew colder, heavier, like something pressing down on them. Clara's nerves were stretched thin. Every sound made her jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. She kept one hand on the revolver tucked into her belt, her fingers brushing the grip every few minutes just to remind herself it was there. Elias seemed calmer, but Clara could see the tension in the way he held himself, the way his eyes never stopped moving. He was a man walking into a fight he knew he might not walk out of, and he was doing it anyway, because of a promise, because of her husband, because of her. They found the camp just before dusk. It wasn't much, a handful of rough shacks and tents scattered along the creek, smoke rising from makeshift stoves, a few men moving between the structures like shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke and unwashed bodies and something sour, like rot. Clara wrinkled her nose and pulled her horse to a stop beside Elias. Is this it? She whispered. He nodded. Blackthorn Ridge. How do we know they're here? We don't. But we'll find out. He dismounted and helped Clara down, then tied the horses to a tree at the edge of the camp. They moved on foot, keeping to the shadows, their boots silent on the damp ground. Clara's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, but no one looked their way. The men in the camp were too busy with their own business, drinking, gambling, sharpening knives, arguing in low voices. Elias led her to a tent near the center of the camp, its canvas sides patched and stained. He crouched down, motioning for her to stay back, and peered through a gap in the fabric. Then he went very still. What is it? Clara whispered. They're here. Her stomach dropped. Are you sure? I'm sure. He straightened, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip, and Clara grabbed his arm. Wait, we can't just walk in there. There are too many of them. I know. Then what are we going to do? Elias looked at her, his eyes hard and unreadable. We wait until they leave. Then we follow. They waited until full dark, crouched in the shadows behind a stack of crates, watching the tent. Clara's legs cramped and her back ached, but she didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched and waited, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Finally, the tent flap opened, and 3 men stepped out. The first was tall and broad, with a thick beard and a scar running down the side of his face. The second was shorter, wiry, with a mean look in his eyes. The third was older, graying, his coat torn at the shoulder. Clara didn't recognize any of them, but Elias did. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his hand tightened on his revolver. That's them, he whispered. The 3 men walked toward the edge of the camp, talking in low voices, and Elias motioned for Clara to follow. They moved silently, keeping to the shadows, trailing the men as they left the camp and headed up a narrow trail that led into the hills. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, and Clara stumbled more than once on loose rocks and hidden roots. But Elias was always there, his hands steadying her, his presence a quiet reassurance. They climbed higher, the air growing colder, the wind picking up, and Clara's lungs burned with effort. Then, suddenly, the men stopped. Elias pulled Clara behind a boulder, pressing a finger to his lips. They watched as the three men gathered in a small clearing, one of them lighting a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his face. "Don't matter what the sheriff says," the bearded man was saying. "Gray's gone, probably halfway to California by now." "You don't know that," the wiry one replied. "He was always stubborn, always had to do things the hard way." The older man spat into the dirt. "Let him come. We'll deal with him the same way we dealt with Mayfield." Clara's blood went cold. Beside her, Elias went rigid, his breathing shallow. She could feel the rage radiating off him like heat from a fire. "What do you mean the same way?" the wiry man asked. The older man grinned, a cruel, ugly thing. "You think that river killed Mayfield? Hell, he would have made it across if someone hadn't cut his saddle strap." Clara's world tilted. She pressed her hand to her mouth, biting back a gasp. "You cut it?" the bearded man said, his voice rising. "Jesus, Carter, you never told us." "Didn't need to." Man was asking too many questions, poking around where he didn't belong. "Had to be done." And Gray, same thing. "If he shows his face, we put him down. Simple as that." The wiry man laughed, low and nasty. "I'd like to see him try." Elias moved before Clara could stop him. He stepped out from behind the boulder, his revolver drawn, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "Then look." The three men spun around, their hands going for their guns, but Elias was faster. He fired once, the shot echoing off the canyon walls, and the wiry man went down, clutching his shoulder, screaming. The bearded man drew his gun, but Clara stepped out, her own revolver raised, her hands shaking but steady enough. "Don't!" He froze, his eyes darting between her and Elias. The older man, Carter, didn't move. He just stood there, his hands raised slightly, a smirk on his face. "Well, well, didn't think you had it in you, Gray." "Shut up," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or what? You'll shoot me? Go ahead, won't change what happened." "You killed him," Elias said, his voice breaking. "You killed James." Carter shrugged. "He was in the way." Elias's finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment, Clara thought he'd do it, thought he'd pull that trigger and end it right there. But he didn't. Instead, he lowered the gun slightly and said, "You're going to tell the sheriff what you just told me. You're going to confess. All of it." Carter laughed. "Like hell I will. Yes, you will. Because if you don't, I'll hunt you down. And next time I won't give you a choice." The bearded man dropped his gun and raised his hands. All right, we'll talk. Just don't shoot." Carter's smirk faded. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, and something shifted in his expression. Fear, maybe. Or the realization that he'd finally run out of road. "Fine," he said. "You win." But as Elias stepped forward to bind Carter's hands, the older man moved. Fast, too fast. He pulled a knife from his belt and lunged, the blade flashing in the dark. Clara screamed. Elias twisted, trying to dodge, but the knife caught him across the ribs, slicing through coat and shirt and skin. He staggered back, blood spreading across his side, and Clara fired. The shot was deafening. Carter dropped, the knife clattering to the ground, and he didn't move again. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the wind howling through the canyon and the ragged gasps of breath. Then Clara dropped the revolver and ran to Elias, catching him as he fell. No. I'm all right," he gasped, his face pale, his hand pressed to his side. "I'm all right. You're bleeding. It's not deep. You don't know that." She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it to the wound, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Blood soaked through the fabric, warm and dark, and she felt tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered. "Don't you dare." Elias looked up at her, his eyes glassy with pain, and tried to smile. "I didn't want you to cry." She let out a choked laugh. Too late. He reached up, his hand trembling, and brushed the tears from her cheek. "Clara, hush. Save your strength." The bearded man and the wiry one stood frozen, their hands still raised, their faces pale. Clara looked at them, her voice hard. "Help me get him on his horse." Now, they obeyed. The ride back through the valley was a nightmare. Elias slumped in the saddle, barely conscious, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Clara rode beside him, one hand on his arm to keep him from falling, her eyes burning with exhaustion and fear. The bearded man and the wiry one followed behind, their hands bound, silent and sullen. The rain started again just before dawn, cold and relentless, and Clara rode through it without feeling anything. She didn't feel the water soaking through her coat, didn't feel the cold biting into her skin. She just kept moving, kept riding, kept whispering to Elias to hold on. Just a little longer, just a little farther. When they finally reached the edge of the valley and saw the town of Stillwater in the distance, pale and small against the gray morning, Clara felt something break inside her. Relief and terror. Because she didn't know if Elias would make it, and she didn't know what she'd do if he didn't. They rode into town as the sun rose, pale and uncertain, and the streets were empty except for a few early risers who stopped and stared. Clara didn't care. She pulled her horse to a stop in front of the doctor's office and slid from the saddle, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "Help!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "Help me!" The door opened, and Dr. Brennan stood there, bleary-eyed and frowning. "Mrs. Mayfield, what? He's been stabbed. Please." The doctor's eyes widened. He looked past her to where Elias sagged in the saddle, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, and his expression shifted. "Get him inside, quickly." They carried Elias into the office, laying him on the examination table, and the doctor went to work. Clara stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, watching as Brennan cut away Elias's shirt and cleaned the wound, his hands quick and sure. "Is he going to be all right?" Clara whispered. "The blade missed anything vital. He's lost blood, but he'll live." Brennan looked up at her. "What happened?" "He was protecting me." The doctor nodded slowly, then went back to stitching the wound. Clara watched, her vision blurring with tears, and felt her knees buckle. She caught herself against the wall, breathing hard, and closed her eyes. Elias would live. He would live, and that was all that mattered. Sheriff Dalton arrived an hour later, his face grim. He found Clara sitting outside the doctor's office, her head in her hands, and sat down beside her. "Heard you brought in 2 men," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "They confessed. To everything. To stealing the money. To killing my husband." Dalton let out a long breath. "And the third? Dead." He didn't ask how. Just nodded. "You did good, Mrs. Mayfield. I didn't do anything. Elias did. You both did." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Then Clara looked at the sheriff. "The warrant. Can you make it go away?" Dalton pulled the telegram from his pocket, looked at it for a long moment, then tore it in half. "What warrant?" Clara's breath hitched. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and stood. "Tell Gray to stay out of trouble." "I will." When Elias woke, the sun was high and the room was warm. He blinked up at the ceiling, disoriented, and then turned his head to see Clara sitting beside the bed, her hand resting on his. "Hey," he whispered. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but smiling. "Hey, did we—" "Yes," they confessed. "It's over." Elias closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with a shaky breath. "Good. You scared me," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was going to lose you." He squeezed her hand. "You didn't. Promise me you won't do that again. I promise." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long time, breathing together, alive together. Outside, the valley stretched wide and endless, the rain-soaked earth beginning to dry, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, sharp and clear and free. As they rode back toward town, dawn crept behind them, pale and uncertain, like forgiveness itself. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tobacco and the sweat of too many bodies pressed together in too small a space. Clara sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones. She'd been awake for most of the night, sitting beside Elias in the doctor's office while he slept fitfully, his face pale against the pillow, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Brennan had assured her he would recover, but the wound was deep, and the fever had come on strong just after midnight, leaving Elias shivering and mumbling words she couldn't quite make out. She'd held his hand through all of it, wiped his brow with cool cloths, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, and when morning came and Sheriff Dalton knocked on the door to tell her there would be a hearing, she'd left Elias in the doctor's care and walked to the courthouse alone, her heart heavy with dread. Now she sat in the courtroom, surrounded by townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle, women in their Sunday dresses leaning close to whisper behind gloved hands, men with weathered faces and suspicious eyes, children fidgeting on hard benches. The air was thick with judgment, and Clara could feel it pressing down on her like a physical weight. At the front of the room, behind a scarred wooden table, sat the bearded man and the wiry one. Their hands were shackled, their faces sullen. The bearded man, his name was Dutch Keller, she'd learned, kept his eyes on the floor. The wiry one, a man called Pike, glared at everyone who looked his way, his jaw clenched, his shoulders hunched like a cornered animal. Sheriff Dalton stood near the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, and at the judge's bench sat Magistrate Horace Whitman, an elderly man with white hair and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He shuffled papers in front of him, cleared his throat twice, and finally looked up at the assembled crowd. "All right, folks, let's bring this to order." The room quieted, the whispers dying down to a low hum and then to silence. Whitman adjusted his spectacles and looked at the two prisoners. "Dutch Keller, Samuel Pike, you've been brought before this court to answer for charges of theft, conspiracy, and—" He paused, glancing at his notes. "Complicity in the death of James Mayfield. How do you plead?" Dutch kept his eyes down. Pike spat on the floor. "Answer the question," Dalton said sharply. Pike sneered. "What's it matter? You already decided we're guilty." "That's not how this works," Whitman said, his voice dry and tired. "You'll have your say, but first I need your plea." Dutch finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not guilty." "Not guilty," Pike echoed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it would make a difference. Whitman sighed and made a note. "Very well. Sheriff, present your evidence." Dalton stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "This is a signed confession from Dutch Keller, taken yesterday evening after he and Pike were brought in by Mrs. Clara Mayfield and Elias Gray. In it, he admits to participating in the theft of wages from the Colorado cattle drive, as well as withholding payment from Mrs. Mayfield and Mr. Gray after the death of James Mayfield." He handed the paper to Whitman, who read it slowly, his bushy eyebrows rising. "And Pike?" the magistrate asked. Pike refused to sign anything, but he was present when Keller gave his statement, and he didn't deny any of it. Pike's face twisted. "Because I knew it wouldn't matter what I said. You people were going to hang us either way. No one's talking about hanging," Whitman said mildly. "Yet." The word hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her stomach twist. She looked around the courtroom, at the faces staring at the two men with cold satisfaction, and realized how quickly sympathy could turn to hunger, how quickly justice could become vengeance. Whitman adjusted his spectacles again. "Is there anything else, Sheriff?" "There is." Dalton hesitated, then gestured toward Clara. "Mrs. Mayfield has additional testimony and evidence." Every eye in the room turned to her. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked to the front of the courtroom. Her hands shook as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the receipt, the one her husband had kept, the one that proved the foreman had acknowledged the debt. "This belonged to my husband," she said, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "It's a receipt, signed by the foreman, J.T. Hollis, acknowledging that James Mayfield and Elias Gray were owed $400 for their work on the cattle drive. Only $200 was ever paid. To me. Months after my husband died." She handed the receipt to Whitman, who studied it carefully. "And you're saying Mr. Gray never received his share?" "That's right. Do you know why?" Clara glanced at Dutch and Pike, then back at the magistrate. "Because they threatened the foreman. Told him if he paid Elias, they'd make sure everyone knew the drive had been mismanaged, that men had died because of negligence." Her voice hardened. "They used my husband's death as leverage." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back muttered something about cowards, and someone else agreed loudly. Whitman rapped his gavel once, calling for order. "Is this true?" he asked Dutch. Dutch didn't answer, just sat there, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "Mr. Keller, I asked you a question." "It wasn't supposed to go like that," Dutch finally said, his voice cracking. "We just wanted our share. We worked that drive same as everyone else, same as Gray and Mayfield. But when the storm came and the herd scattered, Hollis said there wasn't enough money, said we'd all have to take less. And you didn't like that," Whitman said. "No, sir, we didn't. So you stole it." Dutch's jaw tightened. "We took what was owed." "And James Mayfield?" Clara's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "What was owed to him?" Dutch looked up at her for the first time and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "That wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "But it did. Carter did that, not us." "You were there," Clara said, her voice shaking now. "You were there, and you did nothing. We didn't know. We didn't know until after—" "Liar!" The word exploded from her, echoing off the walls, and the courtroom fell silent. Clara's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. "You knew," she said, her voice breaking. "You knew my husband was asking questions. You knew he wouldn't let it go. And you let Carter kill him to keep him quiet." Dutch shook his head, his own eyes wet now. No, I swear we didn't." "Then why didn't you come forward?" Clara demanded. "Why didn't you tell someone what Carter did?" "Because we were scared." Dutch's voice rose, desperate. "Because if we said anything, Carter would have killed us too." The courtroom erupted in noise, shouts, gasps, arguments breaking out in every corner. Whitman slammed his gavel down again and again, calling for order, but it took several minutes before the crowd settled. When the room finally quieted, Whitman looked at Dutch with something like pity in his eyes. "So you kept silent, and let an innocent man's death go unanswered?" Dutch nodded miserably. "Yes, sir. And you would have continued to keep silent if Mrs. Mayfield and Mr. Gray hadn't forced the truth out of you." "Yes, sir." Whitman leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes beneath his spectacles. "God help you, Mr. Keller." The magistrate called a recess, and the crowd spilled out into the street, buzzing with conversation. Clara stayed in her seat, too drained to move. She stared at the empty judge's bench, her mind numb, and tried to make sense of what she'd just heard. Her husband had died because he'd asked questions, because he'd refused to let injustice stand, because he'd been good, and these men had let it happen. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to find Sheriff Dalton standing beside her, his expression solemn. "You did well, Mrs. Mayfield." "I don't feel like I did. You told the truth. That's all anyone can ask." "Will it be enough?" Dalton was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but it's a start." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara alone in the courtroom. She sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of boots on the wooden floor outside, the murmur of voices, the creak of wagon wheels on the street. Then she heard a different sound. Slow, uneven, familiar. She turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a crutch Dr. Brennan must have given him. His face was pale and drawn, his shirt loose over the bandages wrapped around his ribs, but his eyes were clear. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said, rising quickly. "Neither should you." "Elias, I heard what you said." He limped forward, his jaw tight with pain. "Heard all of it. Then you should go back to the doctors. You need to rest. I needed to be here." He reached her and stopped, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You stood up for me, for James, for the truth. It's what he would have wanted. I know." Elias's voice was rough. "But it's more than that. You didn't have to do this, Clara. You could have let it go, moved on. But you didn't." "How could I?" she whispered. "How could I let them get away with what they did? Most people would have. Then I'm not most people." He smiled then, small and tired but real. "No, you're not." When the court reconvened an hour later, Elias sat beside Clara in the front row, his crutch propped against the bench, his hand resting on the seat between them. She didn't take it, but she didn't move away either. And when the magistrate entered and the room fell silent, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She'd said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the law to decide what came next. Whitman took his seat and shuffled his papers once more. Then he looked out at the courtroom, his expression grave. "I've reviewed the evidence presented today, the signed confession from Mr. Keller, the receipt provided by Mrs. Mayfield, and the testimony given by Mrs. Mayfield herself." He paused. "I've also taken into account the statements made by Mr. Keller regarding the actions of the deceased, Carter Boone. and his own complicity in concealing those actions. The room was so quiet Clara could hear her own heartbeat. "There's no question that a crime was committed," Whitman continued. "Multiple crimes, in fact. Theft, conspiracy, and the wrongful death of James Mayfield." He looked at Dutch and Pike. "The question before this court is what measure of responsibility you bear for those crimes." Dutch's head was bowed. Pike stared straight ahead, his face hard. "Mr. Keller, you've admitted to theft and to remaining silent about Mr. Mayfield's death. That makes you an accessory. And while I don't believe you intended for James Mayfield to die, your actions and your inaction contributed to a grave injustice." Whitman turned to Pike. "Mr. Pike, you've refused to cooperate with this court. You've shown no remorse. And while there's no direct evidence linking you to Mr. Mayfield's death, your involvement in the theft and your association with Carter Boone suggest you knew far more than you're willing to admit." He leaned forward, his voice stern. "I'm hereby sentencing both of you to 10 years of hard labor. You'll serve your time at the territorial prison, and when you're released, if you're released, you'll carry the weight of what you've done for the rest of your lives." A few people in the crowd murmured approval. Others remained silent, their faces thoughtful. Whitman rapped his gavel once. "As for the matter of restitution, the remaining wages owed to Mrs. Mayfield and Mr. Gray will be recovered from the assets of Carter Boone's estate and distributed accordingly. This court is adjourned." He stood and left the room, and the courtroom erupted in noise once more, but Clara didn't hear it. She sat frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. It was over. It was finally over. Beside her, Elias let out a long, shaky breath. "We did it." Clara nodded, unable to speak. "He'd be proud of you," Elias said quietly. "James, he'd be proud of what you did here today." She looked at him, her vision blurred with tears. "I did it for him. For both of you. I know." She reached out then and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. He squeezed back, and they sat there together, surrounded by the noise and chaos of the courthouse, and felt something shift between them. Not romance, not yet, but something deeper, something that felt like family. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the dusty street. Clara and Elias walked slowly toward the doctor's office. His arm draped over her shoulder for support, her hand on his back to steady him. People watched them pass, some with approval, some with suspicion, some with simple curiosity. But Clara didn't care. She held her head high, her steps sure, and when they reached the doctor's office, she helped Elias inside and settled him back onto the examination table. "Rest," she said firmly. "Yes, ma'am," she smiled despite herself. "I'll be back later. I need to check on the house." "Clara," she turned one hand on the doorframe. "Thank you," Elias said quietly. "For everything." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked out into the sunlight. The road stretched before her, wide and dusty and familiar, and she followed it home. As she walked, she felt the weight she'd been carrying begin to lift, just a little, but enough. Enough to let her breathe again, enough to let her hope. Behind her, the courthouse stood tall and silent against the sky. And when the gavel fell, the sound was not of judgment, but of something breaking open, the past finally letting go. And when the gavel fell, the sound was not of judgment, but of something breaking open, the past finally letting go. Spring turned to summer, and the land remembered how to breathe. The fields around the farmhouse grew tall with new grass, swaying in waves under the wind like water on a slow-moving river. The garden Clara and Elias had planted together burst into life, rows of beans climbing wooden stakes, tomatoes heavy on their vines, squash spreading their broad leaves across the soil. The chickens clucked and scratched in the yard, fat and content, and the cow in the barn produced milk so rich it left cream thick on the top of the pail. The house itself seemed different, lighter somehow. The windows stayed open now, letting in the summer breeze and the sound of birdsong. The piano in the corner no longer gathered dust. Clara played it in the evenings, soft melodies that drifted out across the porch where Elias sat whittling, or mending tack, the notes mingling with the crickets and the distant howl of coyotes on the ridge. It wasn't the life Clara had imagined. It wasn't the life she'd had before. But it was a life, and it was hers. Elias healed slowly. The wound in his side took weeks to close properly, leaving a scar that pulled tight when he moved too quickly. Dr. Brennan had warned him to take it easy, but Elias was never good at sitting still. He started with small tasks, feeding the animals, checking the fences, oiling the windmill, and gradually worked his way back to the harder labor. Clara scolded him more than once for pushing himself too far, and each time he'd promise to rest, and each time she'd find him an hour later back at work. "You're going to tear those stitches," she said one afternoon, standing in the barn doorway with her hands on her hips. Elias looked up from the saddle he was repairing, his face sheened with sweat. "I'm fine. You're stubborn. So are you." She couldn't argue with that. So she brought him water and made him sit in the shade while she finished mucking out the stalls, and he watched her with something like amusement in his eyes. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know. I can handle it. I know that too." He shook his head, smiling despite himself. "You're impossible. You're welcome." They worked side by side through the summer, falling into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Clara discovered she was stronger than she'd thought, capable of lifting bales of hay, mending broken boards, even shoeing a horse when Elias's side was too sore to manage it. And Elias, for his part, learned to let her help, learned to trust that she wouldn't break, that she'd survive the worst and come through it whole. They didn't talk much about what had happened in the valley. Didn't need to. The memory lived in the scar on Elias's ribs, and the way Clara sometimes woke in the night, her heart racing, the image of Carter's knife flashing behind her eyelids. But they were healing, both of them, in the quiet, steady way that only time and honest work could manage. The money came in late July. Sheriff Dalton rode out to the farm on a hot afternoon, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Clara was on the porch shelling peas when he arrived, and Elias was in the yard repairing the fence gate. They both stopped what they were doing and watched the sheriff dismount, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Mayfield Gray?" "Sheriff," Clara said, setting the bowl of peas aside. "What brings you out here?" Dalton pulled the satchel off his shoulder and held it out to her. "Restitution. From the court. $400. Split between you and Gray." Clara took the satchel, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it and saw the neat stacks of bills inside, more money than she'd seen in her entire life. "This is—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "What's owed," Dalton said simply. "Took some doing to get it out of Boone's estate, but the judge was firm. Said you'd earned it." Elias walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thank you, Sheriff." Dalton nodded. "Keller and Pike are on their way to the prison. Won't be seeing them again for a long time." "Good," Clara said quietly. The sheriff tipped his hat. "You folks take care now." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Clara stood on the porch, holding the satchel, and felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness this time, from relief, from gratitude, from the simple, overwhelming weight of knowing that justice, however imperfect, had been done. Elias climbed the porch steps and stood beside her. "What will you do with it?" "Fix the roof. Buy seed for next year. Maybe get another cow." She looked at him. "What will you do with yours?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't need it. Elias, I mean it. This place needs it more than I do. Use it to keep the farm running. That's what James would have wanted." Clara shook her head. "That money is yours. You earned it. So did he. Then honor that by taking what's owed to you." They stood there, locked in another silent battle of wills until finally Elias sighed. "All right, but I'm putting half of mine back into the farm, for repairs, for supplies, for whatever you need." Clara wanted to argue, but looking at him, at the determination in his eyes, the quiet strength in the set of his jaw, she realized it wouldn't do any good, so she nodded. "Deal." They used the money wisely. New shingles for the roof, lumber for the barn, a second cow, younger and stronger than the first, seeds for planting wheat come fall. Clara even bought herself a new dress, the first new thing she'd owned in years, and wore it to church the following Sunday, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her down the aisle. Let them talk. She didn't care anymore. Elias stayed, not in the barn, but in the small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage. Clara cleared it out, brought in a bed and a chest of drawers, and told him it was his if he wanted it. He didn't say much, just nodded and moved his things in that same evening. It felt right, having him there, hearing his footsteps in the house, the sound of his voice at breakfast, the quiet comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. They weren't courting, weren't even talking about it. But something had shifted between them, something that felt less like friendship and more like family. Like two people who'd been through hell together and decided the only way forward was side by side. One evening in late August, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara and Elias sat on the porch with glasses of cool water and watched the world settle into twilight. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked suddenly. Elias glanced at her. "Leaving where?" "Here, the farm, this life." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day," her heart sank. "Then why do you stay?" "Because every day I think about leaving, I also think about why I came here in the first place." He looked at her. "I came because I made a promise. And I stay because keeping that promise turned into something more." "What do you mean?" "I mean this place. It stopped being a debt and started being a home." Clara's throat tightened. "And me?" Elias smiled softly. "You stopped being James's widow and started being Clara." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat there, her hand resting on the arm of her chair, and felt something warm and gentle settle in her chest. They didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them was full and comfortable, the kind of quiet that only came from real understanding. As summer faded into autumn, the work continued. They harvested the garden, canned vegetables for the winter, cut and stacked firewood in neat rows behind the barn. The wheat they'd planted grew tall and golden, and when the time came to harvest it, neighbors came to help. People Clara had known for years, but who'd kept their distance after James died. Now they returned, offering hands and tools and quiet words of encouragement. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought a pie. The blacksmith helped Elias repair the plow. Even Sheriff Dalton stopped by one afternoon to lend a hand, working alongside them in the field until the sun set and the last of the wheat was bundled and stored. It was the way things used to be, the way Clara remembered from before, when community meant something, when people looked out for each other not because they had to, but because it was right. And standing in the field that evening, watching her neighbors pack up their tools and head home, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in late October, dusting the fields with white and turning the world quiet and still. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift down, and remembered the last winter, the one where she'd been alone, trapped in grief, unable to see a way forward. This winter felt different. The house was warm, the pantry was stocked, the animals were fed and sheltered, and Elias was in the next room, reading by the fire, his boots propped up on a stool, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before. She poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them into the sitting room, handing one to Elias. He looked up and smiled. "Thank you." She sat down in the chair across from him, cradling her cup in both hands. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Coming here?" Elias set his book aside and considered the question. "No. Even after everything that happened. Especially after everything that happened." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I spent a long time running, Clara, from the truth, from the pain, from myself, and I thought that was the only way to survive. But then I came here, and I realized something. What? That survival isn't the same as living." Clara's eyes stung. She blinked quickly, looking down at her coffee. "James used to say something like that. He was a smart man. He was—" They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, the snow falling outside. Then Clara said quietly, "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I." Spring came again, as it always did, and with it came the promise of new beginnings. Elias stood in the barn one morning, checking his saddlebags packed with a few changes, of clothes and a week's worth of supplies. His horse stood ready, saddled and waiting, its ears flicking back and forth. Clara found him there, her heart heavy, her hands clutching a dish towel she'd been using in the kitchen. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Elias turned to face her, his expression calm but sad. "I am. Where will you go?" "West. There's work out in California, ranches looking for hands. Figured I'd see what's out there." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I'm not running this time," Elias said gently. "I'm just moving forward. I know. And you'll be all right. The farm's in good shape. You've got neighbors who'll help if you need it, and you're stronger than you think. I know that too." He picked up his hat and turned it over in his hands, looking at it like he wasn't sure what to do next. Then he set it on his head and looked at her. "Thank you, Clara. For everything. Don't, she said, her voice breaking. Don't make this sound like goodbye. It's not goodbye. It's just different. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his arms coming up to hold her just as fiercely. Don't cry, he whispered. She laughed through her tears. You said that once before. I know. They stood there for a long moment, and then Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. You take care of yourself, Elias Gray. You too. He led his horse out of the barn, swung into the saddle, and looked back at her one last time. The morning light caught his face, and for a moment she saw both the man he'd been and the man he'd become, scarred, tired, but free. He tipped his hat. Don't cry, she smiled. Too late, he turned his horse west and rode away, the dust rising behind him, and Clara stood on the porch watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she turned and walked back into the house, closing the door gently behind her. The farmhouse was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Clara moved through the rooms, her footsteps light, and felt the weight of everything she'd survived settle into something softer, something like peace. She sat down at the piano and let her fingers rest on the keys. Then she began to play, the tune Elias had played that night, the one her husband had written. It was simple and sad and beautiful, and as the notes filled the room, Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of release. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the fields. The wheat swayed in the breeze. The chickens clucked in the yard. The windmill turned slow and steady, creaking softly in the wind. And Clara played, her heart full, her spirit finally, truly free. Months passed. The seasons turned. The farm thrived. And one afternoon in late summer, as Clara hung laundry on the line, she heard the sound of hooves on the road. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a rider approaching. Her heart skipped. The rider came closer, and she saw the familiar shape of his hat, the way he sat in the saddle, the quiet confidence in his posture. Elias. He rode into the yard and dismounted, his saddlebags worn, his face tanned and weathered but smiling. Thought I'd come back, he said simply. See how you're doing. Clara set down the laundry basket, her hands trembling. How long are you staying? Depends. On what? On whether you'll have me. She stared at him, and then she laughed, a sound full of joy and disbelief and relief all at once. You damn fool, she said. I know. She crossed the yard and took his hand. Then stay, I will. And he did years later when people asked Clara about the man who lived at the Mayfield farm. She told them the truth. He was a friend, a partner, a keeper of promises. He was family. And when the wind blew across the fields and the sun set behind the hills casting long shadows over the land, she'd sit on the porch beside him and watch the world settle into evening. And she'd think about the night he'd first arrived, a stranger in the rain, carrying secrets and grief and a promise he'd refused to break. She'd think about the man she'd lost, and the man she'd found, and she'd smile. Because the story didn't end in tragedy, it ended in grace. In the quiet courage of opening a door to a stranger, in the stubborn belief that promises mattered, in the slow, steady work of healing. And so the story ends where mercy began, in the quiet act of opening a door to a stranger. The land stretched wide and endless and free, and Clara Mayfield was home.